Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Cook Inlet Tug and Barge is a marine transportation company specializing in harbor services with a primary marketing focus on the Port of Anchorage, providing their customers with quality-based service specifically tailored to their needs.
It's never too early to set expectations and goals for your child's education. The UA College Savings Plan provides opportunities that can help you reach your educational savings goals. Save in Alaska. Study anywhere. There is more information available by calling 1-888, the number 4, and then Alaska. This message sponsored by the UA College Savings Plan.
The National Weather Service.
Good Wednesday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with you on this 15th of January. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with the latest watches, warnings, advisories, satellite and radar pictures, and weather observations in your part of Alaska by going to weather.gov or, with the whole statewide view in mind, arh.noaa.gov. You can find the weather on the telephone at 800-472-0391. And when you go there, remember the codes that you're punching in to get to the part of Alaska that you're interested in. The next time you can punch those in a little bit faster and not have to wait for the prompts, and it'll make your experience a little bit easier. On Twitter, you can find each Weather Service office there, NWS Anchorage, NWS Juneau, and NWS Fairbanks. We're all on the same Facebook page under U.S. National Weather Service Alaska. We love to see your snow reports there and wind reports as that happens over the next several days. And on YouTube, if you search for AKWX TV, you'll also find a daily briefing as well as the entire broadcast brought to you in part by Alaska Public, the station you're watching right now. Here's a look at what we're seeing across southeastern Alaska tonight. Winter weather advisories and winter storm warnings continue for the Haynesboro and the Lynn Canal, and up around Skagway, that's a winter weather advisory. We're expecting accumulating snow to continue there as we head into the evening and overnight hours there. Up around the Copper River Basin, a winter weather advisory for 4 to 8 inches of snow. That will go through this evening into Thursday morning. That's mainly going to be Glen Allen and north, so heavier snowfall there as you approach the Alaska Range itself. Into the Susitna Valley, generally north and west of Talkeetna, also under a snow advisory there, so it's not the farther southern locations that you see actually painted on the map. Are expecting, again, 4 to 8 inches of snow there. That will wind down about 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. And for southwestern Alaska, a freezing rain advisory continues there through Thursday morning. Let's look a little bit further north first, though. Across the Brooks Range summits, winter weather advisory and wind chill advisories are in effect. And wind chill advisory there for the coastal areas of the central Beaufort Sea. We're talking about wind chills that could drop to 50, maybe even 55 below, and visibilities may drop below a half mile at times, especially along those Brooks Range summits. So cold and wind will be a rule. And once again, for the Bristol Bay region, we're looking at a freezing rain advisory. That will mainly be for areas south and west of Dillingham. Everything north probably dealing with a little bit more snow. And eventually, it looks like it's going to snow across the eastern parts of the Aleutians. With that in mind, and the wind that's coming along with it, that could reach upwards of 50 miles per hour, perhaps by Thursday night and into Friday, a blizzard watch is in effect now for the eastern Aleutians. That will include Nikolsky and Unalaska. So a lot going on in all the different parts of Alaska tonight. Around the Bering Sea, you can see the cold air dropping southward, but watch for each of these circulations, a number of them already gathering enough moisture that it's got many of the meteorologists around Alaska watching this whole setup very carefully. You can already see a deep southerly flow working in ahead of the low pressure system here passing through the eastern Aleutians tonight. And you can see another puff of moisture there east of Tokyo. That is a sign that the subtropical parts of the Pacific are wanting to connect up with the circulations heading for Alaska. As that happens, that's going to draw in a lot of heat and moisture into southern parts of Alaska, and some of that may eventually move into the interior parts of Alaska as well as southeast. So we're watching all this very carefully. Looking at around Kodiak Island and points south and north today, you can see that moisture is streaming northward fairly quickly. The leading edge of that next band of clouds already making its way into the interior, where we expect an opportunity for up to an inch of snow by tomorrow. For southeast, periods of heavy rain were found yesterday. Some of that record setting there around coastal areas, and more rain and snow is on the way. The snow continues to fall mainly around the Lynn Canal and Haynesboro and Skagway tonight. Look for periods of heavy rain around the northern Gulf Coast. Yakutat today had over 1.3 inches of rain. And it's going to be a wet period around the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island. You may see snow initially, but rain is certainly back in your forecast. For the interior, wind and occasionally some snow will be found there. It looks like that warm and wet air will be reaching your region, especially for some of the higher terrain. Of course, the lower terrain may still be trapped under some of the seasonal inversions. Across the Brooks Range, look for blowing snow and dangerous wind chills, mainly along the Brooks Range passes and across the eastern and central Beaufort Seacoast. Wind chill values there once again could drop to 50, maybe 55 below. You can see a current wave of low pressure here just south of Unalaska. If we plot that on the weather map, you'll see that's about 973 millibars there. Snow was falling around the Alaska Peninsula and parts of Bristol Bay, and there were areas of freezing rain detected, mainly inland and north of Dillingham this afternoon and this evening. Snow was falling around Chickaloon. In fact, by midday today, they reported up to a foot of new snow. That was since yesterday afternoon and evening, and snow was falling up and down Cook Inlet, around Prince William Sound, all the way to Yakutat, and across the central and northern parts of southeast. With high pressure parked across western areas of British Columbia, we also notice another wave of low pressure across the central and western Aleutians, the cold front dropping into the Arctic coast with snow showers there, mainly around Atkasuk and points east. High pressure will try and set up there around Barrow tomorrow. It's not really strong enough to keep things terribly stable. However, it will lock in a low deck of clouds, perhaps across the evening and overnight hours tonight and into early morning hours tomorrow. A weak cold front is going to try and swing in across that. It will probably fall apart. It's not looking quite as stout as it once was, but there certainly is some colder air to the north. Warmer air is working across the Alaska Range and into the interior. With that, do expect a better chance for some snow showers across places like Fairbanks, Northway, and Eagle. And to the west, you can see what that's doing to some of the precipitation chances across the Bristol Bay region. Freezing rain once again is possible in that area. Low pressure just east of Kodiak Island at 985 millibars. A very strong southerly fetch will blast another round of rain and snow into parts of southeast, with the focus being probably north of Sitka to around Yakutat for the heaviest precipitation. To the west, you can see another occlusion shaping up across the central and western Aleutians. It doesn't seem to budge very much for Thursday. Neither does the frontal boundary locked across the interior and just north of the Alaska Range over the Kuskokwim Bay and points south. But low pressure, because it's not moving, has to do something, and in this case it decides to deepen or strengthen at 951 millibars. So now what we've done is open up the entire Gulf, tapped into that subtropical moisture, and we've got strong southerly fetch moving into places like Kodiak, the Alaska Peninsula, southwest Alaska, the Gulf Coast, and parts of southeastern Alaska, with more rain and snow coming in. During the daytime tomorrow for South Central, expect waves of rain and snow. There will be an opportunity for some freezing rain, and that threat seems to have minimized somewhat. And then perhaps by the end of the day, it may be all rain across South Central Alaska. So not the best forecast if you're a winter enthusiast or just like to see things a little bit whiter rather than slushier, but it does look like things are turning over to more of a liquid form across the Gulf Coast. For the interior, there will be more snow opportunities for you. In fact, as I mentioned, around Fairbanks, things could add up to about an inch, maybe a little bit more across some of the surrounding higher terrain. By Friday, the low is on the move finally, and for areas south and west of Kodiak, you can see the low up from 951 millibars to 954. However, another portion of that has spread over into Bristol Bay, dropping to 949 millibars. So this is a pretty potent storm. And once again, we'll be dealing with some winds, especially on the back side of this, running through the eastern Aleutians. Once again, where a blizzard watch is posted for your area. There will be accumulating snow, could be up to 3 to 5 inches or so. The winds, though, are the part that makes it a blizzard, and if those reach over 35 miles per hour, in this case, they could go as high as 50 miles per hour, then that would be a blizzard there, especially if the visibility drops. Cold fronts working across the eastern parts of the Gulf, once again tapped into that subtropical moisture. Pockets of heavier rainfall will be possible there, and again, that could be moving into southeast, the northern Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, and parts of south central Alaska, with snowfall spreading north and west from the low and also into the interior across the middle and upper Yukon valleys. Blowing snow is possible across the Brooks Range, and as we've seen already, that could make for a winter weather advisory in your area, not to mention to drop the wind chill to dangerously low levels at 50 to 55 below. There doesn't seem to be a lot of precipitation for the Arctic coast or areas around Nome even at this point, but you'll certainly start to see more clouds as we get into Friday and Saturday. The thing we're watching very carefully at this point is this pattern doesn't seem to shut off as we get into next week. In fact, it could go well into next week. So again, if this type of weather causes an impact to what you're doing around your part of Alaska, stay tuned because there certainly could be some repeats in the schedule ahead. 40s and temperatures well into the mid 40s for southern parts of southeast today. A very mild day for most of the area there. 30s and 40s for most of Prince William Sound. 30s southern parts of the Kenai Peninsula. 43 in Kodiak around Anchorage and the Mat-Su. Most areas warmed into the lower to mid 20s. 30 in Glen Allen today. 3 below around Fairbanks this afternoon. Northway and Eagle we're showing temperatures into the teens. Excuse me. Fort Yukon was about 17 below, and most of the Brooks Range stayed well below zero, anywhere from 15 to 25 below, with the Arctic coast as cold as 31 below around Atkasuk. Nome was 11 below, with Shishmaref at 4 below. Norton Sound temperatures generally in the single digits there, about 2 below around Selawik, and it looks like 7 above in Bethel. For most areas in Bristol Bay, you saw temps in the 20s and 30s with the Alaska Peninsula at or above freezing. St. Paul and St. George were in the 20s and mid-30s for Adak and Atka. Overnight low temperatures will be in the 20s for most of the chain, with 30s for the Alaska Peninsula, 35 in Kodiak, 30s to about 40 degrees for southeast, with parts of Prince William Sound still in the upper 20s to about 30 degrees. Whittier, one of the colder spots. Homer and Seward in the mid-20s, as well as Anchorage cooling to about the upper 20s tonight. With rainfall setting in, though, it doesn't appear at this point that freezing rain will be much of a problem as temperatures begin to warm up after midnight. So this may be one of the colder spots of the evening, and that should happen pretty early on. For the overnight hours in Fairbanks, 5 below, 9 above in Eagle, and once you get north of the Yukon once again, temperatures drop to about 20 to as cold as 30 below. The Arctic coast looking at temperatures approaching 40 below around Wainwright. 18 below in Nome, 25 below there around Shishmaref, and for south and western Alaska, temperatures generally in the lower 20s with highs there approaching the upper 30s if you're around King Salmon tomorrow. 41 in Kodiak, low to mid 40s for a large part of southeast, again getting in on a huge warm-up. For areas in the Copper River Basin with snow falling, temps may hold in the 20s, but a little bit farther south and west, that warm air is building across the Kenai Peninsula where temperatures will stay above freezing tomorrow. For the interior, 8 for the high in Fairbanks. For areas west around Tanana and Nenana, look for temperatures to be a little bit colder, closer to 0 in fact. Around the Yukon Valley and north of the Brooks Range summits, anywhere from 5 to 20 below. In the Arctic coast, looking at temperatures about 25 below. Nome's looking at 3, Unalakleet about 2 below, and looks like Bethel about 7 above tomorrow. Flying weather will be hampered tomorrow with a lot of moisture moving into southeast. Look for a wide swath of IFR across southeast, and again periods of rain probably pushing northward during the midday hours. So you may see some improvement across the southern half of south central as the day goes on, but that will simply reset and will make it all happen again on Friday. Out to the west, pockets of IFR across the Bering Sea and MVFR across the Arctic coast. Here's your pass conditions. Anaktuvuk and Adigan Pass both look to be okay. VFR conditions there. For Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, expect some improvement during the day, but you'll likely spend at least half of it at IFR. Same goes for Rainy Pass. IFR conditions to start. Windy Pass, we expect instrument flight rule through most of the day. Isabel Pass expected to be IFR. Mentasta Pass, we should see MVFR conditions perhaps by mid to late day. And for Tanita Pass, expect IFR conditions to develop throughout your Thursday. Portage Pass will likely be IFR. There may be some improvements during the day, but again, that could be a gradual improvement there for the Prince William Sound side. For the western side, maybe some more rapid improvements. And Chilkoot and White Pass expect IFR to start your Thursday. Freezing levels show the weather changes that are coming. You can see that warm and wet air building into the coast once again, and what we didn't see tonight was a rapid onset of that overrunning that would have set up a freezing rain situation across south central. So after we set up the afternoon weather balloon, things changed very quickly and told us that the models might have been off just a little bit. That's good news. Now for southeast, you can see that warm wet air building in over you. If you don't need more rain, that's bad news. 2,000 to 8,000 foot freezing lines there, and the cold air dropping to the south will allow places in the eastern Aleutians again to set up for snow and wind perhaps by the end of the week. Tomorrow's icing potential shows that moisture and cold air are all combining across the interior. You can see those levels as low as 8,000 feet and to the surface. Some of that could reach occasional to widespread moderate there, below 5,000 feet south of Sand Point, and below 12,000 to above 7,000 feet across parts of southeast. The jet stream indicates a pretty healthy dose of low pressure wrapping into the Aleutians and then dropping south, making that subtropical connection almost to Hawaii and then bringing that back up across the Alaska range. A more potent Arctic vortex there, dropping in some faster winds across the north. This will keep the cold out of Alaska while sending it to the lower 48. They'll get clipper type systems, and Alaska will get the warmth and wet air. 9,000 feet shows that south and westerly flow wrapping in across the Alaska range and into southeast. More of a north and drier flow coming in across the Arctic coast and the Brooks range with low pressure working right over the Pribilofs there, making kind of an upside down U shape. Out across 3,000 feet, here's low pressure south of the Alaska Peninsula, more of a north and easterly flow dropping in behind that low pressure system in the North Pacific, and our ridge of high pressure guiding in that warm and wet air into the Gulf Coast. And light winds there, anywhere from 15 to about 30 knots or so coming across the interior, winds 10 to 20 knots across the Arctic coast. As far as turbulence goes then, we're watching below 12,000 feet. We saw a number of reports not only of rime today, but also of turbulence. Most of that tomorrow will be below 12,000 feet across the Gulf Coast and Kodiak Island, and below 8,000 feet across the southeast, with another band of stronger shear and winds setting up across the North Pacific. That's a look at your aviation forecast. We'll be back with your marine weather here in just a few minutes.
General aviation. It's an industry comprised of 650,000 pilots flying over 200,000 aircraft. And the missions of general aviation are as diverse as its pilots and aircraft, and the individuals and businesses that own them. Unfortunately, an unacceptable number of these general aviation aircraft, their pilots and passengers, have succumbed to senseless and often tragic crashes. And the highest percentage of these crashes have been caused by human error, namely pilots making poor safety of flight decisions. What's even more alarming is that the same mistakes are being made over and over again throughout the industry. As you go through this training and watch the scenarios, we suggest that you should concentrate heavily on the error chain depicted in each scenario and how these steps ultimately lead to a crash. Ask yourself, what were the contributing factors? Were there opportunities to break the chain? Did the pilot exhibit a specific safety attitude or value system that might have influenced his decision-making? And were there direct and/or indirect pressures affecting the decisions of the pilot? Now, let's begin the scenarios. Guy was a successful consultant for a prominent commercial insurance firm. He was also an experienced pilot with commercial and instrument ratings and thousands of hours of accident-free flying logged over the past 20 years. His present airplane, a Cardinal RG, was one he had owned for the past 5 years. He took his aircraft ownership seriously. He would regularly take recurrent flight training to keep his skills sharp, practice his basic skills often, and took an equally active role in the maintenance of his airplane. He recently treated himself to a completely new avionics stack for his plane, and he was understandably anxious to take a trip with his new gear. He felt he deserved it as a reward for the high-pressure, long-hour work environment of his profession. It wasn't long before the opportunity for that trip came about. He had just signed a new high-profile client, and his boss told him to take a few days off. Because Guy was also a certified scuba diver, he decided to fly his newly equipped plane to a resort location for 2 days of diving. On Saturday night, after he finally wrapped up his paperwork, he carefully planned his trip for a Sunday morning outbound flight, 2 days of diving, and a Wednesday return. The next morning, he did another weather check, worked up a weight and balance, and filed his VFR flight plan since the weather was perfect. He also calculated that the trip could be done non-stop and still have him arrive with at least 1 hour of fuel remaining, which was his personal minimum. After a detailed pre-flight inspection, including a visual fuel inspection, Guy loaded the airplane with his luggage and dive gear and departed for his vacation. Once level in cruise, Guy pulled out the instructions on his new avionics and began playing with the equipment. The time went by quickly for him, and it didn't seem long before he was entering the pattern for his diving destination. The next morning, his diving activities began. This first day was his planned heaviest day of diving, with a shorter day of shallow dives planned for the second day, so that he would have plenty of time to rid his body of nitrogen before his Wednesday flight home. His first dive of the first day was a deep dive to explore a wreck, followed by a more shallow reef dive to finish out the morning. That afternoon, he dove another wreck in relatively deep water and then finished out his first day of diving with a night dive later that evening. His problems began when he returned to the hotel and received a voicemail to call his boss at the office no matter how late it was. During the call, Guy's boss told him that the new business deal was starting to go real bad and the client demanded a lunch meeting for tomorrow. Arguing the issue didn't seem to be an option for Guy, so he said he'd depart first thing in the morning and be there by lunch. He was a little concerned about the time between his last dive and the flight, but figured it would be enough. Early the next morning, he checked the weather and filed an IFR flight plan because there were some IMC conditions along the route. Then he called the FBO and ordered a top-off for his departure. The line crew fueled the plane before he got there, but did not top it off correctly, leaving the plane short of full tanks. Guy hurriedly pre-flighted and climbed in for departure. In his haste, he didn't visually check his fuel levels this time, nor did he even review his total gallons purchased when he signed the credit card bill. He believed he had full fuel by his gauges, even though he knew his plane could indicate full even when not completely topped off. He quickly got into the air for his homebound trip. This flight home wasn't nearly as enjoyable. Guy was consumed with the varying weather conditions, dealing with his new and unfamiliar radios under IFR, worrying about his business deal, and also wondering why he was having such discomfort in his arm and fingers, which worsened as the trip progressed. With about an hour left to go in his destination, Guy suddenly realized that his fuel gauges were indicating quite low. He had also forgotten to do his regularly scheduled tank switching routine for long cross-country flights, and his selector had been on both for the entire trip. The weather had finally improved, and with nothing but wooded terrain ahead between Guy and his destination, he briefly considered stopping and checking his fuel. But the discomfort in his arm and unfamiliarity with his new navigation equipment and his belief that he didn't have the time to go to another airport and make his appointment caused him to quickly abandon that idea and hurry home instead. Plus, he reasoned that his total time for this leg would be about the same as his outbound leg. He did get his tanks topped off, and his gauges must be wrong. So, he continued on for his home base.
Thanks for staying with us for your marine forecast. We'll touch quickly on the sea ice edge. You can see ice here all the way down past Kenai into the Cook Inlet there. Chances are with a warm-up, a lot of this is going to go away there. So barge traffic there may like to hear that news. Out across the west, though, northerly winds and persistent flow will likely advance that ice edge. And you can see St. Matthew here is getting pretty close to seeing that move close to the island there. It's already south of Nunivak Island, still well north, though, of the Pribilofs on the continental shelf, of course. Here's a look at southeast. Look for south and easterly winds to pick up as we go through Thursday, anywhere from 35 to 45 knots as you head up toward Yakutat with 19 to 20-foot seas there in the north and eastern parts of the Gulf. The inner channels looking at 25 to 35 knots with 5 to 7-foot seas. On Friday, a south and southeasterly flow continues for all areas up to 35 knots there across the southern inner channels with 7-foot seas, and south and easterly winds diminish somewhat across the north and eastern parts of the Gulf. It's still riding high at 40 knots with a 20-foot sea. In South Central, look for north and easterly winds coming across Prince William Sound at 25 knots with a 6-foot sea. Southeasterlies much stronger just outside at 40 knots with 18-foot seas. Northerlies coming out of Seward and Homer in the Barren Islands at 25 knots with 15-foot seas there. Easterlies coming into Kodiak Island at 25 knots. And a north and northeasterly wind will be persistent across the Cook Inlet at 10 to 20 knots. As we get into Friday, though, that switches to more of a north and easterly flow. You can see the warmer air riding into Homer and Seward. 35 to 40 knot winds expected there with 19-foot seas. Easterlies up to 45 knots. Very strong gales at 23-foot seas are expected there, and easterlies up to 40 knots inside Prince William Sound with a 10-foot sea. It looks like a rough day there. For the Alaska Peninsula, an east and northeasterly flow on the Pacific side at 35 knots with 15 to 16-foot seas, and southeasterlies inside Bristol Bay with a 4-foot sea. Northeasterlies just north of Cold Bay up to 30 knots. As we get into Friday, easterly flow coming down the Bering Sea side 25 to 30 knots with 6 to 10-foot seas, and on the Pacific side we're still looking at a southeasterly flow at 35 knots, curving around to the north and east as you get out toward King Cove and Sand Point with an 18-foot sea there. Across the Aleutians, a northeasterly flow on the north side at 35 knots with freezing spray an issue across the west. More of a broad westerly flow sweeping south of the chain and then becoming northerly as you get into Adak and Atka and the waters south of Nikolsky and Unalaska. On the north side, that's 25 to 40 knots. On the south side, 30 to 40 knots on Thursday. And as we get into Friday, you can see it sweep to more of a north and westerly direction, anywhere from 15 knots around Kiska to 40 to 45 knots, and a strong gale south of Unalaska and Nikolsky with an 18-foot sea there, and freezing spray is an issue there across all these zones. Adak around 25 knots on the north and south side, and southwesterlies return to the western parts of the chain with a 35-knot wind. Across the west coast, a northerly flow sweeping across St. Matthew and the ice edge. Freezing spray will remain an issue there in all these areas. Across Kuskokwim Bay, 6-foot sea, and a northerlies around the Pribilofs with a 25-knot flow. By Friday, northerlies continue across the northern half of the Bering, switch to more of a northwesterly flow over the Pribilofs with a 15-foot sea. Northeasterlies coming off the continent and out of Kuskokwim Bay with an 8-foot sea on a 25-knot wind. Across the Arctic coast, north and westerlies become light across areas in the Beaufort Sea, and northerly flow 10 to 25 knots across the Chukchi Sea coast into the Bering Strait. That picks up a little bit more on Friday, up to 35 knots around Kotzebue Sound. And north and westerlies continue very light, 5 to about 10 knots or so across the Beaufort Sea coast. Recapping tonight's weather, several waves of low pressure are moving across the Gulf, the Pacific, and will eventually move into Bristol Bay by the end of the week. One new wave working into the northern Gulf will bring more rain and snow through a large part of south and eastern Alaska tonight, with freezing rain in the west, snow advisories across the Copper River Basin and northern Susitna Valley. In most places there, looking at a good 4 to 8 inches of snow after Chickaloon picked up a good foot today. For southeast, periods of heavy rain will continue. Snow will be heavy at times across the north, and snow is possible in Fairbanks tomorrow, up to an inch there, and more rain for south central tomorrow. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, and thanks for watching.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.